Have you ever wondered what the outcome of an Hausa man falling in love with an Igbo woman would be? Well, that is exactly what the story is about. Stick around and find out how the love story between Umar and Adezi will transcend, especially with the type of families they come from. From the heart of northern Nigeria, in a small village surrounded by dusty winds in the desert, lived a young Hausa man named Umar. He was the eldest son of a respected family, known for their long history of tradition and influence. His father, Alhaji Bello, was a pillar of their community, a man whose word carried weight. Umar grew up in the shadow of his family's expectations. His life was mapped out for him from a very young age, just like every other man in his family. As much as Umar respected his family's traditions, he also felt like there was something more for him out there. He wanted more than just what was expected of him. He wanted to choose his own path, to fall in love with someone of his own choosing, not someone who had been picked for him. But in a family like his, where marriage were seen as alliances between families, love was always secondary. His parents had always told him that love was a luxury, something for the naive. What mattered was the family name, wealth, and status. Umar had accepted this for a long time. He knew he would marry a woman chosen by his father, just like his grandfather had. That's how it worked, and there was no room for questions. But everything changed when he went to Lagos on a business trip with his father. It wasn't supposed to be anything out of the ordinary. They were attending a trade conference looking to expand their family's business interests. But then he met Adaeze. Adaeze was an Igbo girl, and from the moment they met, Umar knew she was different. She was very sharp, confident, and beautiful in a way that caught his attention. She wasn't like the women he knew from his own community. She had a fire about her, a kind of energy that pulled him in. Raised by her father, Chief Nwosu, a powerful man in the East, Adaeze had spent her life breaking free from traditional expectations. She was a speaker, an advocate for women's rights, and she wasn't afraid to ever speak her mind. They met at a dinner, a gathering of business elites in Lagos. Umar was there with his father, and Adaeze was introduced to him as one of the keynote speakers. She had just finished a talk on women's empowerment, and they struck up a conversation. At first, it was just a small talk, polite and formal, but as the night went on, the conversation deepened. Adaeze spoke passionately about her work, about breaking away from the old ways. Umar listened, fascinated. The way she saw the world was so different from how he'd been raised, and yet there was something about it that just made sense. By the end of the evening, Umar couldn't stop thinking about her. He had always followed the rules all his life. He had always lived up to the expectations of his family. But Adaeze made him question everything. What if there was another way? What if he could choose his own path? Over the next few months, they stayed in touch, mostly through text messages. At first, it was just casual about the conference, their businesses, and other professional topics. But gradually, their conversations became more personal. They shared their dreams, their frustrations, and the things that mattered most to them. The more Umar got to know Adaeze, he realized that she wasn't just some woman from another tribe. She was someone who saw him for who he truly was, not just the son of Alhaji Bello. And the more they talked, the more he felt drawn to her. Daisy, too, felt something shift. She had always been independent, never letting anyone dictate what she could or couldn't do. But Umar was different. He wasn't like the other men she'd known. He was thoughtful. He was kind. and open to seeing the world beyond boundaries that had been set for him. He didn't just want to be with her because she was beautiful. He wanted to understand her, to see the world through her eyes, and she found that incredibly refreshing. But as much as they both wanted to be together, they knew the reality they were up against. Omar's family would never accept a marriage to an Igbo woman. His father had always made it clear that marrying outside their Hausa community was not an option. The divide between the North and the East was deep, cultural, religious, and even historical. Adese's father, too, would never accept an Hausa man into their family. There was no way their families would ever approve. The connection between them grew even more. What had started as innocent conversations had turned into something deeper, something neither of them could ignore. They were in love, and the more they tried to fight it, the harder it became. Umar found himself torn. Could he really defy his family? Could he go against everything he had been raised to believe? Was love worth the risk? One night, after months of secret messages and stolen meetups, Umar made up his mind. He was going to ask Adeze to marry him. He knew it would be hard. He knew it would break his father's heart. But for the first time in his life, he didn't care about tradition or expectations. He just cared about Adeze. So he asked her, and she said yes. When their families found out, the reaction was exactly what they'd feared. Omar's father was furious. "You've betrayed your people," he shouted. "You will never find peace with a woman from a different tribe. This is not who you are." Adese's father was just as upset. "An Hausa man? What kind of shame are you bringing to this family?" Everyone was against them. Their families, their communities, everyone told them they were going to make a big mistake. The pressure to give up, to fall in line, was overwhelming. But through it all, Umar and Adeze stayed strong. They had made a choice and they weren't going to let anyone take that away from them. They knew right from time that it wouldn't be easy. They knew the road ahead will be filled with challenges and pain. But they also knew that love was worth fighting for, and together they were ready to face whatever came their way, because in the end, love was the only thing that mattered to them. The day of their wedding came, and the room was heavy with anticipation. The air was thick with unspoken words. Umar stood at the altar, his hand gripping Adese's, and the quiet hum of their traditional music played in the background. It felt like time had slowed. Around them, the gathering was a mix of cultures. His northern Hausa relatives in their rich embroidered attire, and Adese's Igbo family, proud and unyielding in their own colorful regalia. But the space between them seemed infinite, divided by centuries of tradition, by the weight of expectations. But yet, it felt like this moment was somehow bigger than all of that. Umar's father, Alhaji Bello, sat rigid in his seat, his face carved from stone, his eyes cold and unwavering. He was clearly very displeased. He had been silent all day, a silent judge at his son's wedding. On the other side of the room, Adese's father, Chief Wonsu, sat with his arms crossed, his expression tight, as if he was prepared to fight this union with every breath in his body. It wasn't just a wedding, it was a battlefield. As the officiator asked Umar if he would take Adese as his wife, Umar could feel the weight of the room bearing down on him. The disapproving eyes of his father, the murmurs of his relatives, the judgment in the air. It was as if the whole room was looking and holding their breath, waiting for him to crumble, to break under the pressure. But he didn't. Yes, Umar said, his voice firm, his gaze never wavering from Adesi's. He could hear the subtle gasp of surprise, but he didn't care. He was making a choice, his choice. When the officiator turned to Adesi, the room held its breath again. Her father's stare was icy. He couldn't even look at her. His anger was thick and palpable. But Adesi stood tall, undeterred, her eyes fierce, determined. She had fought for this moment for her whole life. I do, she said, her voice clear, cutting through the tension like a blade. She didn't flinch, not even for a second. And then, just when it seemed like they had won, that the room would finally exhale, Chief Nwosu stood up. His chair scraped loudly against the floor, and suddenly all eyes were on him. His face was a mask of fury, veins bulging at his neck. The room seemed to shrink around him, as if he were about to explode. You both think you can defy everything, all the years of tradition, all the history that has shaped us? He barked, his voice sharp, his every word laced with venom. This marriage is an insult, a disgrace to everything we stand for. Do you think you can just erase the past with a couple of vows and a fancy ceremony? There in the room, still, it felt like everything had stopped. Adese's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't look away from her father. She was no longer the little girl he could control. She was a woman, and she would not be silenced. Omar could feel the walls closing in around him. His father's eyes were locked on him now, unreadable, full of judgment and disappointment. His family's expectations had always been clear: marry within the Hausa community, keep the legacy strong. But here he was, standing in front of them, with Adesi by his side, ready to throw it all away. But then, something shifted. Alhaji Bello stood up slowly, his tall frame casting a long shadow over the scene. His eyes were fixed on Chief Wonsu, his gaze unwavering. Enough, he said, his voice calm but commanding, louder than it had ever been. I will not let you destroy my son's happiness. This marriage is not a betrayal. It is a choice made by two people who love each other. If you cannot understand that, then so be it. The room fell into a stunned silence. Chief Wosu's face reddened, his fists clenched, but he remained still. It was as if Alhaji Bello's words had stopped him in his tracks. The two men now stood as adversaries, the tension between them thicker than ever. For a long moment, neither man moved. The silence was deafening. But then, without a word, Chief Nwosu turned away from the altar. He looked at Adaeze, his daughter, for what felt like an eternity. His eyes were filled with a mixture of rage and resignation. I will not be part of this disgrace, he muttered, his voice low but cutting. I will not watch this happen. If this is the path you choose, then walk it alone. You are no longer welcome in my house. The door slammed behind him with a finality that reverberated through the room. It was as if the air itself had been sucked out, and everything stood still. For a heartbeat, no one moved. But then, a slow murmur started to rise, whispers turning into voices, voices into applause. Some of Adese's relatives stood, unsure of whether to support her or disown her. Some of Umar's family, who had been holding their breath, finally exhaled, their approval slowly turning to acceptance. And in that silence, in the chaos that followed, Omar and Adeze stood there, hand in hand, their eyes locked on each other. They had defied everything to be here, to get to this moment. The road ahead will not be easy. There will be no fairy tale ending. But right here, right now, they felt like they had won. Not the battle with their families. No, that would come later. But they had won the most important battle of all, the battle of their love. Alhaji Bello, after a long pause, finally nodded to his son. It wasn't a blessing, not in the traditional sense, but it was enough. It was his way of saying, I understand now. And Adese's eyes, though filled with sadness over her father's rejection, shone with something else. She wasn't just fighting for their love anymore, she was fighting for the freedom to choose her own path. As the ceremony continued, the sounds of celebration began to fill the room again. But for Umar and Adesi, it was the quiet victory that mattered. They had chosen to cross a line, stepped into the unknown, and in doing so, they had rewritten their own stories. A day went on and the ceremony came to an end. Umar and Adesi felt happy about how everything had transcended. But little did they know that Chief Nwosu had not accepted this, and he was going to do everything within his power to ruin this marriage, or so he thought.